In the remote village of Meliandou, deep within the lush greenery of Guinea, a 2-year-old boy begins his day like any other. He plays near the trees, a small figure in a quiet, rural routine where the only sounds are the rhythms of local life. The forest bordering his home is ancient and teeming with invisible life, including the bats that roost in the hollow trees where children often gather. But by evening, a strange burning fever takes hold of his small body. His family watches, confused, as the child's strength vanishes in hours. There is no explanation, only a sudden, inexplicable shift from health to a state of total physical collapse. The silence of the village is soon broken, as neighbors who came to comfort the family begin to fall ill themselves. The sickness moves through the narrow paths of the community, jumping from house to house without a visible trail. Within days, the local healers and elders, who have seen many things, find themselves powerless against a shadow they cannot name. A heavy, suffocating fear settles over the region. Markets close and families stop visiting one another as the small, concrete reality of village life is replaced by a desperate, panicked silence. The boy dies in December 2013, followed quickly by his sister, mother, and grandmother. The grief of the family is absolute, but they are unaware that their tragedy is not an isolated misfortune. This localized terror is the first spark of the deadliest Ebola outbreak of all time. What was unfolding in the forests of Guinea was not merely a new tropical illness, but the re-emergence of the Zaire Ebola virus, a pathogen previously confined to Central Africa, thousands of miles away. Unlike malaria or typhoid, which were common and understood in the region, this agent operated with a terrifying biological efficiency. It attacked the immune system directly, dismantling the body's ability to clot blood and causing systemic organ failure. But the true horror lay in its incubation period. A person could carry the virus for days, traveling, working, and interacting with loved ones before showing a single symptom. By the time the patient collapsed, they were already highly infectious, turning every act of care into a potential death sentence. The scale of this event was unprecedented because it was no longer behaving according to the historical rulebook. Previous outbreaks had occurred in isolated, disconnected hamlets where the virus burned itself out before it could reach a road. This time, the silence of the international community and the lack of local diagnostic tools allowed the virus to simmer undetected for months. It was a biological time bomb ticking in the blind spot of global health surveillance. By the time the World Health Organization officially declared an outbreak in March 2014, the virus had already skipped across the borders into Liberia and Sierra Leone, carried not by wind or water, but by the unsuspecting compassion of human beings. To understand how a boy in a village could trigger a collapse across 3 nations, one must look at the world he lived in. The region where Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone meet is known as the Mano River Union, an area where national borders are merely lines on a map, invisible to the people who live there. Families stretch across these lines. A market day in one country attracts traders from the other 2. It is a place of constant, fluid movement, where motorcycle taxis weave through forest paths and trade routes connect remote villages to bustling mining towns. This mobility, usually the economic lifeblood of the region, became the virus's greatest asset. Furthermore, the social fabric of these nations was still healing from decades of brutal civil wars. The healthcare infrastructure was not just fragile. In many places, it was non-existent. Hospitals were understaffed, lacking basic supplies like gloves and running water. A deep-seated distrust of government authority, a scar left by years of conflict, meant that when officials eventually arrived in hazmat suits, they were often viewed with suspicion or hostility. The population relied more on traditional healers and community elders than on distant ministries of health. This was a rational response to their history, but in the face of a viral predator, it created a disastrous gap between the people and the only medical protocols that could save them. The origin of the catastrophe's acceleration lay in the very intimacy of West African culture. In these communities, death is a communal event, and the preparation of the body for burial is a final sacred act of love. Relatives wash and embrace the deceased, ensuring a dignified passage to the afterlife. However, Ebola is most contagious at the moment of death, when the viral load in the body is at its peak. Every funeral for an early victim became a super spreader event. One funeral for a respected healer in Sierra Leone, attended by hundreds of mourners from different towns, is estimated to have linked hundreds of subsequent cases. The virus exploited the best parts of human nature, the desire to care for the sick and the need to honor the dead. Simultaneously, the medical response inadvertently acted as an amplifier. When the sick were finally brought to local clinics, doctors treated them for malaria or cholera, the most logical diagnoses based on symptoms. Without isolation wards or protective gear, these clinics became distribution hubs. Doctors and nurses, the guardians of the community, began to die at alarming rates. When the healers die, panic takes over. Patients fled hospitals, fearing them as places of death, and returned to their homes, taking the virus back into the crowded neighborhoods. The mechanism of spread was not complex. It was a tragic cycle of misdiagnosis, unprotected exposure, and the terrifying efficiency of a virus introduced to a population with no biological or historical immunity to it. The irreversible turning point arrived when the virus did what no one thought it could. It moved to the cities. By mid-2014, Ebola had hitched a ride from the forests to the sprawling, densely populated capitals of Conakry, Freetown, and Monrovia. These were not quiet villages. They were chaotic urban centers with millions of inhabitants living in close quarters, often with poor sanitation. The arrival of Patrick Sawyer, a Liberian-American who collapsed upon landing in Lagos, Nigeria, signaled to the world that this was no longer a local crisis. The virus was now an international traveler, capable of boarding a plane. It was in the slums of Monrovia, specifically the neighborhood of West Point, where the situation spiraled into chaos. The government, terrified and overwhelmed, attempted a medieval solution in a modern city, a forced military quarantine of an entire district. Barbed wire was rolled out, and soldiers were deployed to block roads. This decision, born of panic, severed the trust between the state and the people completely. Riots broke out, isolation centers were raided, and infected patients disappeared into the labyrinth of the city. The illusion of control vanished. It was the moment the epidemic outpaced the human capacity to contain it through force, proving that without community cooperation, no amount of military might could stop a microscopic enemy. The collapse that followed was total. For months, the sound of sirens became the soundtrack of West Africa. The healthcare systems of 3 nations effectively dissolved. People suffering from treatable conditions like malaria, complications in childbirth, or diabetes died in their homes because hospitals were closed or too dangerous to enter. In the streets, the social contract unraveled. The fear of contagion overrode centuries of social norms. People stopped shaking hands. Mothers were told not to hug their feverish children. The no-touch policy, necessary for survival, induced a deep psychological trauma on a culture built on physical connection. Emotionally, the toll was visible in the empty spaces left behind. Entire families were wiped out, leaving behind Ebola orphans who were often shunned by surviving relatives out of fear that the child carried the curse. Bodies were sometimes left in the streets for days because burial teams, overwhelmed and exhausted, could not keep up with the death rate. Yet amidst this horror, the resilience of the human spirit emerged. Ordinary citizens, finding the international response too slow, organized themselves. Neighborhood watch teams began to educate their peers. Contact tracers risked their lives to track chains of transmission, and survivors, now immune, returned to the treatment centers to comfort those dying in isolation. It was this community-led pivot, more than any foreign intervention, that eventually began to bend the curve. By the time the outbreak was declared over in 2016, the landscape of West Africa had been fundamentally altered. More than 11,300 people were officially dead, though many believe the true number is higher. The economies of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone had lost years of growth, their fragile development set back by a decade. But the consequences extended far beyond the graveyard. The survivors, numbering in the thousands, faced a new reality. Post-Ebola syndrome, a condition of chronic pain and vision problems, coupled with the heavy stigma of having been a host to the plague. They walked as living reminders of a time everyone wanted to forget. Historically, this event forced a painful reckoning within the global health architecture. It exposed the World Health Organization's sluggish bureaucracy and the world's dangerous apathy toward health crises in poor nations. It shattered the illusion that a disease in a remote village stays there. As a direct result, new rapid response mechanisms were created, and the development of the RSV-Zebov vaccine was accelerated, a scientific triumph born from the ashes of the tragedy. The world had learned that in the age of jet travel, biological security is a collective responsibility. Today, looking back at the empty schools and the overgrown graves of Meliandou, the lesson remains urgent. The 2014 Ebola outbreak was a dress rehearsal for the pandemics of the future. It demonstrated that walls and quarantines are not enough if trust and basic healthcare are missing. The virus exploited our connections, but it was defeated by them, by the cooperation of scientists, local communities, and global resources. As we navigate a world of emerging pathogens, we must remember that the health of the most vulnerable child in a remote forest is intimately connected to the safety of us all. If you found this analysis of the Ebola crisis valuable, consider subscribing for more documentaries that explore the history behind the headlines.